Hello, this is Jerry here. Welcome to Malachi Part 9, Chapter 4. So last week we saw that God never ignores or forgets his own people. Past, present, future, the Lord is always there with his own, which is an important and inspiring message at the close of the Old Testament, and for us today. As we've gone through Malachi, you might have noticed how often the divine title Lord of Hosts occurs, and also in our recent coverage of Haggai and Zechariah, and how the Lord names himself in Malachi and in other books is super important, because it's God communicating, I want you to understand this about me, and be encouraged by this truth. Now, if you read the NIV version, which is a great translation, it has chosen to translate Lord of Hosts as Lord Almighty, which is fine, but I think it's helpful to remember the nuance we're going to talk about with this divine name. Hosts means a vast population, most often an army, a host of soldiers, though this can also be used of God's great sovereignty over the hosts of stars in the heavens. Overall, the Lord of Hosts reveals God as the great sovereign commander-in-chief of the heavenly army, or any human army he chooses to use. He's the Lord of all armies. He decides how each battle fares. Do you remember what Bible story this is picturing? Yes, the Syrians had surrounded the town of Dothan, hunting Elisha. Elisha's servant was filled with fear. "Alas, what shall we do?" he said to Elisha. The prophet responded, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." If you could see in the dark shadows in the middle of the picture, the Syrian army around the walls. And Elisha prayed that the Lord would open his servant's eyes to see the hosts of God's angelic army protecting them. It's a good verse to tuck into your mind, as it is still true for us. When the Jews were preparing to attack Jericho as they came into the promised land, a man stood in front of the commander Joshua with a drawn sword. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Probably the pre-incarnate Son of God here, because removing one's shoes on holy ground doesn't speak to an angel, but to God. Joshua is ready for orders to do something, just like us so often. Just tell us what to do. But first things first, the Lord said, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." Worship before action. Recognize who you are serving and obeying. Then came the orders. And I love that answer to which side are you on? Neither, the NIV says. Joshua, the military commander, came to appreciate that day how the Lord of Hosts could not be considered in the little boxes of this side or the other. He was the sovereign majesty over all. However, the Lord of Hosts title occurs in so many non-military contexts as well, because spiritual warfare is not restricted to human military battlefields. Satan opposes every bit of spiritual progress. For example, in Daniel chapter 10, God sent an angel to reveal truth behind a vision that God gave to Daniel. As the angel arrived, the Lord had him explain why this angel was delayed. Then he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words." The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief priests, came to help me and make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. We would not have guessed that a well-organized spiritual battle was involved with this angel coming to reveal truth to Daniel. A demonic prince and his forces were in charge over Persia, where Daniel was this Jewish missionary in the Persian court, the devil's territory. The archangel Michael was God's reinforcement to get the job done. Daniel notes, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people." So Michael was the powerful archangel over God's people. And here is Ernesto Galicia's statue in Mexico City of the Archangel Michael, with his flaming sword above Lucifer the serpent, and a pretty stern countenance. Now, it's very significant that the Lord refers to himself as the Lord of hosts most often in that era of Jewish history when the hosts of Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia were over the Jews. Not just their armies, but huge political structures with these large nations. The Lord referred to himself as the Lord of hosts 80 times in Jeremiah, about 60 times in Isaiah, as both prophesied of Assyria and Babylonia a lot. Then 14 times in the 2 chapters of Haggai, 53 times in the 14 chapters of Zechariah, and 24 times in the 4 chapters of Malachi. God wanted his people to remember he was always the Lord Almighty and the victorious commander-in-chief over all. And God is still the Lord of hosts. James chapter 5 thunders against the wealthy taking advantage of the poor. "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." So evildoers should beware of exploiting others. As we are in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, let me remind us that Patrick Henry of Virginia, who on March 23, 1775, urged the Second Virginia Convention to form a militia and prepare for war against Mother England. After listing all their unsuccessful attempts to change the course of the British Crown and Parliament, he passionately concluded, "An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us." Well, this was back when the common person had much more understanding of the Bible than now. They would catch that inference, the God of hosts, the God of armies. And Virginia then did begin to prepare for war. Now, the Lord of hosts, or the NIV rendering, the Lord Almighty, these are titles for us today. The term occurs about 260 times in the Bible. Again, not just in military contexts. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And Psalm 46 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Well, who is this God who is our refuge and strength? Twice it is said, "The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." Okay, this divine title, the Lord of hosts, was a sidebar because this term occurs so often in Malachi. In chapter 4, we have the final words of Malachi and the Old Testament, with one command and one prophetic promise. Today, the command. "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel." So Horeb is another word for Mount Sinai. The Lord exhorts, hold fast to the revelation God has given you of the law, God's covenant with them. We, in this New Testament era, often perceive the law of Moses as only negative. It doesn't help that so many religious leaders abused and distorted the law in the Gospels and Acts, and more confusion about the law in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. God's law was not bad. Yes, it exposes a human negative, sin. But let's not blame the message or the messenger, God, because we needed to understand our sinfulness so that we know our need of God and His forgiveness. The Lord would not have instituted a bad system for His people. So let's think of the law through the heart and mind of King David for a moment. Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep His testimonies, who seek Him with their whole heart, who also do no wrong, but walk in His ways. You have commanded your precepts to be kept diligently. Oh, that my ways may be steadfast in keeping your statutes. Then I shall not be put to shame, having my eyes fixed on all your commandments. I will praise you with an upright heart when I learn your righteous rules. I will keep your statutes. Do not utterly forsake me. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. So the law presents God's way or path to journey on. Psalm 119, verses 1 to 2, Blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. And notice how the blameless path is synonymous with those walking in God's law. It's stated so positively. Blessed are those. Now, notice all the verbs in the small section of 119, Psalm 119 that we just read. Walk, keep, seeking with their whole heart, doing no wrong, having one's eyes fixed on the commandments, praising the Lord as one learns the righteous rules, guarding one's way according to the word. We see the active, devotional life God wanted through His law. The law was not a sterile list of commands and sacrifices, but it mapped a way, a journey for a joyous, faith-filled life with God, with clear boundaries and ways of confessing sin and receiving forgiveness. But to someone not in fellowship with God, all those laws might seem a great burden. And that's actually where the priests had come to in Malachi. The keeping of God's commandments was burdensome, resented, a chore. And it's the same in our New Testament faith. Lots of people think Christianity and church is a royal waste of time. For example, Reddit is an online site where people can just share experiences and advice. It's also a popular place to rant. Here's a thread called Christianity is Too Time-Consuming. Let me quote exactly as written. When I was a Christian, I never really had any hobbies. I never really watched shows, read books, listened to non-Christian music, etc. It's crazy how much I limited myself. I started listening to music, reading actual books, and I feel so much happier and liberated. Yeah, exactly. How do Christians not get tired eventually of their lack of freedom? And then another response. I got so much free time since I stopped going to church and was finally able to breathe. I am able to pursue my personal interests and ability to self-reflect after years of spiritual abuse. It's very easy for others to negatively frame what Christians, quote, have to do. You all have to go to church every Sunday. You are pressured to give money. You all are pressed to go to other meetings and to read your Bible. And they are thinking through their own grid. If they were placed in our situation, it would be a have to, not a want to. But that doesn't reflect our experience because of our living faith. And it was the same in the Old Testament. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." And faith is key here, both in the Old and New Testaments. It is not true that people in the Old Testament were saved by their works. Nobody has ever been saved by their own works, nor were they set up as though they needed to be saved by their own works. God's program has always been about faith, from Adam and Eve forward. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. Now that's a quote from the Old Testament book of Habakkuk. And Romans 9, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. So when we don't have faith, of course the scriptures in the Old Testament and New Testament lifestyles of obedience are going to be burdensome to us. The Bible is not like a self-help book where we provide the energy around best practices. It is a supernatural book animated by the Holy Spirit to those who have faith in the Lord. How many of you can attest to the difference in how the Bible reads before and after coming to faith in the Lord? Well, the law was also a great teacher. The law presented who God is, His holiness, righteousness, justice, but also His mercy, love, and patience, and His forgiveness as presented in the system of sacrifices. The law prophesied of the Messiah and taught the people about themselves, their sinfulness, and their need of God and His forgiveness. They learned of their absolute dependence upon God for life and spiritual life, and of their future hope in the Messiah. Galatians tells us that the law was our guardian until Christ came. The guardian here referred to a tutor. Greek and Roman parents would sometimes hire an educated servant to oversee their children's schooling. The tutor would follow them to any formal lessons in a school and then help manage their learning. So God gave the law to nurture the nation, to understand about God and how to fellowship with Him. And the Lord also used His law not only to teach, but to convict, to correct, to renew His people when they strayed. Now, some time ago, you probably remember when we covered the dramatic story of King Josiah of Judah. Now, he came to the throne after the extremely long and wicked reign of King Manasseh, who reigned 55 years, and then his son Ammon for another 2 years. Manasseh led Judah into such wickedness and so far away from the Lord that when the God-fearing young King Josiah came to the throne, he had to start Judaism all over, repairing the long-forgotten temple and restoring the worship system. And while they were repairing the temple, Hilkiah, the high priest, found the book of the law in some room. So he sent it to the king through the king's secretary, Shaphan. Let's read. Then Shaphan, the secretary, told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. He didn't even call it by its name. I'm not even sure he understood what it was. And Shaphan read it before the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, saying, Go, inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. King Josiah gathered all of Judah and read this book of the law to them, and they renewed their covenant with the Lord. And they were turning against idolatry, celebrating the feasts again. God used his law to convict and set the nation back on track with him. We also saw this in our studies in the book of Nehemiah recently, chapter 9. And the Israelites stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers, and they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God. For a quarter of the day, for another quarter of it, they made confession and worshiped their God. The Jewish leaders did not try to talk the nation into repentance, but they read God's divine word to the people. That was powerful. Remember that long prayer in Nehemiah 9 that rehearsed God's creation, and then the call of Abram, and then Moses, and then the exodus out of Egypt, and the miracles and the preservation of God's people through the wilderness, and placing them in the promised land. It was a huge, long prayer. Well, that was what they just had read. Because remember, the law included Genesis and Exodus, and out it came into their prayer. Now, as good as the law was, God chose to make a new covenant even better. Not meaning that the law of Moses was bad, but in God's progressive revelation, he chose to reveal and develop even more promises and blessings to his people. And that's the message of the book of Hebrews, the better new covenant. There's no need to cling to or mourn the old covenant. It was his plan all along to usher in the new through the old. But in the meantime, for those living in Malachi's day, remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Well, let me summarize. The people in Malachi's day needed to keep their faith in the Lord and maintain their adherence to the law that God had given to them. It was their needed pathway. It will teach them about their God. It'll teach them about themselves and their need of him and how to fellowship with him. And if they begin to go astray, the Lord will use that word to convict, to correct, to renew them. And the law and the rest of the Old Testament will teach and prepare them for the coming Messiah, both individually and as a nation. A very appropriate and timely exhortation at the close of the Old Testament revelation, because the Lord knew that the Messiah would arrive some 4 centuries later. Next week, Lord willing, we will finish Malachi as we focus on the prophetic promise given in the last few sentences. Thanks very much.